All right, hello and welcome to Conscious Miami. This is episode 1, and I am Seth Czerepak, the natural law shaman practicing here in Miami, Florida. And this podcast is part of our mission to guide you through your spiritual transformation, whether a spiritual awakening, a journey through the dark night of the soul, or just your ongoing commitment to spiritual growth. And our other mission is to facilitate authentic connections between spiritually minded people all over the United States and the world, starting here in our home city of Miami, Florida. And that's why this is called Conscious Miami. And we're going to be doing that through our podcasts and also through some of our local events and our events in places around the world that we're going to be talking about, hopefully a little bit within the next couple of months. And I'm going to go ahead and hand things over to my lovely co-host, Kraehmer, and she's going to kick us off.
Hi, everyone. Here, another Miami local. I love the Sunshine State, and I love the spiritual community that we have, not only already, but that we get to grow and expand our consciousness with today and every day. Today is going to be one of those amazing episodes where we actually get to touch into what exactly is a spiritual awakening. This can be something that's a little bit mysterious or seen, maybe even a little bit woo-woo, if you will, but we're going to explore it in so many different ways that whether you're on the Western side of medicine or the Eastern side of spirituality, I'm sure you're going to be able to pick apart something from this episode. So I'm actually not going to reveal what I think a spiritual awakening really is just yet. I'm going to put Seth's feet to the fire because he's definitely the more earthy, fiery one of us, and ask you, Seth, what do you think a spiritual awakening is?
Well, I'm going to give a complicated definition, then give you a metaphor that I think will help to make the complex simple. But I think of a spiritual awakening as an elevation in a person's awareness or in their consciousness that happens so drastically and so suddenly that it seems like a categorical change in someone's awareness. And the metaphor that I would use is if you're climbing a building, you're climbing the stairs of a building, and every time that you reach a new level, you look out the window and you look at what you saw when you were maybe on the first floor, the second floor, the third floor, and the things that seemed like insurmountable, large obstacles right there in your face, and like the worries and the cares of this world, like what people think of you and your bills, your deadlines, your boss, all these little ordinary things of everyday life, they become smaller and smaller as your consciousness elevates, and you also have a wider view of the landscape. That's the metaphor that I would use. And I think what happens to a lot of people is we are climbing the stairs one, story at a time within our life as we grow and develop. And sometimes people go back down to the first floor because something happens to them that's traumatic and gets them scared, and they get back into the material world level and they're not thinking about spiritual things. And we all go through periods like that in our life. And then some people get stuck wandering around the same floor for years or decades even. But a spiritual awakening, I would say, when you accidentally stumble upon the elevator that shoots you up 5 to 10 floors, and all of a sudden the change in your awareness is so big and so dramatic that it's almost disorienting.
I didn't see that one coming. Well, I don't think you ever see spiritual awakenings coming. I don't think you plan for them. I don't necessarily think that my spiritual awakening happened all at once. Like, I didn't really hop on that escalator or that staircase. I feel like me personally, I was like, okay, I'm going to go up a couple of stairs, got scared, ran straight back down to the bottom floor, and I was like, this is not for me. And then slowly like, oh, it is kind of nice having this awareness, as you call it, or just this knowing, and think of it more as painting this wide escape of what we think of reality. So I originally would think that, okay, the world seems very black and white when you're thinking very logically, and you're like, okay, this is how things should be, or this is how I was raised growing up. And then when you get hit with that quote unquote spiritual awakening, it's like bringing color into the world. And suddenly you're like, okay, seeing different perspectives, feeling emotions that you've never felt before, and kind of being handed this paintbrush that you're like, okay, I'm going to see where this takes me, this part of the journey. And if I don't like it, then I'm just going to paint over it, or I'm going to, walk away from my art piece for the moment. So that's a more feminine, I think, approach to take a little bit of, this.
I think that's a good metaphor, because people who are really, and I was at this point, it's because of the way I was raised, people who think very categorically and very rigidly in black and white, they have a very low resolution view of the world. And those low resolution views of the world are very good for being decisive and knowing what to focus on and what not to focus on, which is why I think when all these new colors and these new details get introduced into your life, it's almost disorienting in a way, but it helps you experience life and experience people in a much richer and authentic way, and to have more grace with people too. So I like that analogy.
What do you think causes a spiritual awakening to happen?
Sometimes I wish I knew, because I'm on my third one right now, and I think there are different types of spiritual awakenings. But for me, and there's a fellow named Alfred Korzybski, and a lot of people don't know this, but he was the philosopher who invented what we now call NLP. He invented something called the science of general semantics. He wrote this enormous 800-page book called Science and Sanity on it, which is horrendous to read. It's just like this vomit draft of all these guys' ideas. But there's a lot of brilliant stuff in there. And one of the things he talks about is called logical fate. And that's when a person has a categorical, logical view of how the world should operate and how the laws of cause and effect create certain outcomes. And logical fate is when your model or your map of the world and how the world should work comes crashing against the rocks of the laws of cause and effect, and you suffer some sort of an epic failure or disappointment or letdown. And you have a choice at that point. You can either go to your thinking processes and go, well, there's really something wrong with the way that I've structured things in my mind, and the world doesn't work the way that I thought it did. And I think that, I think of the metaphor that you use, it's like that logical structure breaking into pieces sometimes is what creates all those different colors and those different experiences. Or it forces you to flee, to the elevator to get away from the fire on the stairs, to follow my analogy. And it's like, you have to elevate your consciousness to find a new way of thinking about the world. But the other thing you can do is you can have a logical fate, experience where you just go, oh, there must be something wrong with that other person and the way they responded to me, and they shouldn't have reacted that way. And you refuse to restructure your thinking, and that's when you stay in darkness. But to me, it's like an epic failure, a heartbreak. Most of the people I know who have had a really serious spiritual awakening has come after some sort of trauma. And a lot of the time it's a betrayal from someone who you really believed in. I saw that response.
I had to raise my hand. Like, I promise, as we do all of these episodes, that I'm just going to be the most authentic version of myself. I'm not going to try to be like the quote unquote all-knowing type of spiritual person. I'm just going to be like, nope, this has been my experience. And, I didn't get to choose, quote unquote, this path. I think sometimes it chooses you, and it will put you straight into that shadow realm. So, you said you're on your third?
Yeah. I think there's three different types of spiritual awakenings. And I remember like the last woman I was married to, she had a spiritual awakening like right after her and I met, where she went from being an atheist to being a born again Christian. I remember she came home one night because she was kind of wandering. Spiritual awakenings make you do some really weird stuff. And she was wandering around at like 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning outside, just kind of introspecting. And she said she saw this vision of an owl, a dragon, and a phoenix. And the owl, I think, represents the intellectual masculine. I know an owl is a predatory bird that can see in the dark. And that's kind of like what the sacred masculine is like. It's the part of us that goes out there and breaks past barriers and imposes our will on the world. And you have a spiritual awakening like that, and it gives you this power to act in the world and to create results that you couldn't normally create before. Like during my second spiritual awakening, where I became a born again Christian, my income went up 5 times. And that's because I had a new understanding of some of the spiritual laws that Jesus taught that, created material results in your life. but that was a very masculine spiritual awakening. And I still had a lot of really rigid and hard ways of looking at things, which helped me to stay focused and to make things happen in the world. But the more feminine spiritual awakening, I think that's what the dragon represents, the serpent, which is more fluid and more graceful. And that spiritual awakening for me has happened just um, actually a couple of years after that. And then the last one is the phoenix. And I think the phoenix is the representation of the ultimate death and rebirth of your ego, which I think is the most painful spiritual awakening. And I've met people who only had the masculine type of awakening and have not integrated the principle of grace into their spiritual life. And they understand spiritual things and they have a relationship with God, and they may read and study their Bible and meditate every day, but they also can be really rigid, judgmental people because they haven't had the more feminine awakening.
Mhm. I like how you explained all three of those. I'm revisiting my memories now, and I'm like, okay, in my mind, I've only had one like major spiritual awakening, and then I feel like I've had these moments of like expanded consciousness. So I grew up very Western minded. I didn't have a lot of like, this is gonna sound strange, but like I didn't know what yoga was. I didn't know what necessarily consciousness was as far as like the spiritual side of everything. I didn't know what a shaman was. I grew up in a religious background, which would go into Christianity or something of that nature. I knew what Christmas was, but spirituality and how we would explain spirituality from religion, which, just to take like a quick detour, I break those apart this way, and you can tell me if you think there's a difference in this. But spirituality, I think, is like the translation of hope when you break it down, versus religion would be the basis of where hope is found. So that's how I divide it, like how you express hope versus where you go find hope. So spirituality, I go more into like consciousness. And I would say be more Western based. I think of like the subconscious, like Freud, or I think of discovering the id, the ego, the super ego, getting into more psychology type of principles. So when I was first getting that hard awakening, which came through my major trauma, if you guys are following this show, you may have been able to find out more about me, which goes into that darkness, that heavy, Phoenix type of energy where like everything gets reevaluated in life. I took my first steps into spirituality, trying to figure out, what does my subconscious do? How does that like rewire my brain to be able to show up in the world, to be able to understand my identity? Like having that shatter of not knowing who you are, I think was the foundation of my spiritual awakening, which goes back to your Phoenix analogy of like, you have to get burned, you have to go to ashes to start that regeneration process. So I don't.
That's profound. Yeah, because I'm hearing that and I'm thinking about how much our identity, especially in the Western world, is tied up in the roles that we sort our life into, our income level, our status, our occupation, and things like that. And when you suffer that logical fate and those categories shatter in some way, your ego and your identity is so tied up in those things that it breaks along with them. And then you kind of try to take all the pieces and put it back together, or you just sweep it aside and say, well, there must be something else to me. And I like what Eckhart Tolle said about this when he said, I came to a point in my life when I couldn't stand myself. I couldn't stand being around myself anymore. And he thought, well, if I think that, there must be more than one of me. And if that's true, which one of me is real?
Mm-hmm.
And so that reevaluation of a person's identity is huge, because it talks about that in all the spiritual traditions. Christianity, it talks about that in Hinduism and yoga, all of them.
I want to say that, and ask you also, my spiritual awakening did come with like an aesthetic manifestation change that you could see in the physical realm. And it came out much like the Phoenix. In fact, whenever I was still in my previous careers, the modeling, I had this flaming red hair like a phoenix. And when I had that spiritual awakening happen, that heavy trauma, I actually dyed my hair black. And I thought that was, looking back, more reflective as the being burned to ashes type of thing. I did not know who I was anymore. And going into that darkness level, the shadow realm or even shadow work, is where a lot of spiritual transformation happens. And they don't necessarily call it a spiritual awakening in the Western world. They would say that, you're going through depression, or you're going through a midlife crisis, or you are
Nervous breakdown. Yeah.
nervous breakdown, anxiety. Like, they'll name it so many other things in the Western world versus just saying, like, no, maybe you're spiritually expanding yourself. Like, the way that you think is changing, or who you want to be is changing. So I don't know. Did you have any physical changes, or have you
I
always
had some weird, well, my first spiritual awakening came when I was 17 years old. I was what you would call, I called myself a Satanist when I was 16 years old. I didn't really believe there was a God, but I was doing all of the stuff that was in the Satanic Bible, like the West Wall rituals and stuff. You don't know this about me, but there were some very dark things that I'm not going to share. And I got a couple of my friends and some girls I was dating sucked into it. But I was basically just a hedonistic atheist. I thought it was cool to scare people and to explore that darker side of myself that I didn't get the opportunity to explore when I was a kid, for reasons we can get into later. But when had my spiritual awakening at 17, it was basically just me knowing there's a spiritual world. And so I thought, well, if there's a devil and there's demons, there must be a God too. And I was really mad about the fact that there was a God, because I didn't want to believe in God because of the way I've been raised. And so that had a profound impact on like the way that I thought, but it didn't have any weird impact on like my personality. My second spiritual awakening, when I became a born again Christian at 26, was really weird. Like, there are certain foods that I didn't like. Like, I hated V8 before that, and I started drinking a lot of it. I hated rap music before that, and I started listening to gangster rap, which was really weird because I was a pastor at the time, and I was listening to like Ice Cube and Eminem and um, NWA. And I still don't know where that came from because I hated that style of music. And I also started liking reggae and Bob Marley music, which I still love. No idea where any of that came from. It was just a really odd shift that didn't seem to have anything to do with a spiritual awakening. So that's the closest thing I can think of.
I see it. I see exactly where that came up. I was actually talking with a girlfriend of mine this morning, and this is something that does come out of the spiritual awakening once you get off the turmoil part and you get more to the like encompassing, loving version of the spiritual awakening. So maybe this is a good segue. But the spiritual awakening requires more acceptance. And especially the first spiritual awakening, as you would say, or even I would say minor ones, as you get deeper levels of your consciousness, require more of that self-acceptance. My goodness. Self-acceptance, the development of the self-concepts, understanding again that who am I question. And when I was sharing it with her, she was like, okay, well, I don't like those parts of me. Like, I don't like to express that type of darkness, the insecurity, the unknowing, the fear of failure, all those, shadow elements. And I was like, okay, well, take a pause, because when it comes to leveling up or expanding that consciousness, you have to see both. You have to learn to accept both the darkness and the light, and learn how to express those in a different way, a healthy way. So for instance, for you, it might be, okay, suddenly you like this rap music, but you're not doing rituals that are hedonistic. It had to come out in a different way that was more friendly, I'm gonna say, for lack of a better word, for the environment or for, yourself, your own soul. But the moment that you are rejecting either of those, whether it's your light or your dark, you're actually rejecting both, because they do both live in you. It's kind of that polarity within yourself. So when you express, you're like, okay, I was, not wanting to believe in God, but yet you were trying to worship the devil, that doesn't add up, right? It's just like within ourselves, when we start to expand that consciousness, that spiritual element of ourselves is, okay, maybe you come from an avoidant attachment in your childhood, and that is part of you. That is something that's been ingrained in part of you. But if you want to move towards more loving, healthy relationships that are secure, then you need to be able to acknowledge and accept that that's part of you, while also accepting the part of you that wants to have the nurturing, loving, expressive relationship. So
I love that. And I think we should spend a few minutes talking about this. I knew we were going to get into shadow work
yay.
because what Air is saying, there's a saying that I think it's in a Tom Waits song. He says, "I'm afraid that if I exercise my devils, that my angels may leave too." And I've been studying a lot about shadow work and the Hermetic principle of polarity. And I believe your shadow self and your highest self are on the same spectrum. That if that hidden aggression, like it wasn't okay for me to be aggressive and assertive and sarcastic and to express what I call my choleric side when I was a kid. I couldn't do it. And so I found different ways to get my aggression out. And I think that may have been where I started getting interested in rap music, because it's a very aggressive style of music. But if you deny that part of you, it's like it doesn't have the opportunity to participate in social interactions along with the rest of you. And so your assertive self, if it's repressed at the age of 13, they call this arrested development. If it's repressed at age 13, you could be 30 years old. And then when an opportunity comes in your life, when you really have to stand up for yourself, to stop people pleasing, to tell someone to stop overstepping your boundaries, the you that comes out to do that is the 13-year-old you, the angry, socially awkward, weird person that ends up saying stuff that you regret because it hasn't had the opportunity to grow up for those other 17 years. But if you do embrace it and bring it out into the light of consciousness, like Carl Jung talks about, and let it develop, that's a part of you that has the ability to achieve things that you haven't achieved before, because you now have the ability to be straightforward, to be assertive, to stand up for yourself. And so I think what you said about, wanting to deny that part of you, it's like what you bury, it gets buried alive. It's there for a reason. It's there to meet a very specific need in your life. And if you don't allow it to come out of the shadows and mature and evolve along the rest of you, it's going to come out eventually when it needs to. And when it does, it's going to be a monster. And I think that's what Carl Jung meant by the shadow.
Inviting your demons to tea.
Yeah. Let them have a seat at the table, where they can actually learn proper etiquette. And then there's times when your demons have to come out. There's times when you have to be aggressive and you have to be assertive with people, like especially knowing like a man's perspective of the world is we have to be protectors. And we don't live in a society where we have to, fight to defend the people we love as much anymore. But if we lost the structure of civilization, all of a sudden there are people who were trying to conquer the country that we lived in. Hopefully the men in this country would be able to go home and get their knives or their swords or their guns or whatever it is, and like embrace the warrior in themselves and protect the people that they loved. And if you can't do that, well, then you can't be a morally good person if you can't protect people. So I think embracing the darkness has a purpose. It's there for a reason. And if you repress it, whatever it achieves, whatever it pursues is going to be a very dark purpose. And if you bring it out into the light and let it mature and let it be used as it's supposed to, it becomes a tool for good. It's like turning the light up, the dimmer switch. We think of light and darkness as being different, but really darkness is just the absence of light. And as you turn the dimmer switch in your room from dark to light, it turns to light. There's no difference between the two except for in scale. It's the same thing with a lot of our traits that we see as dark. As we allow them to come out in the light of consciousness, they actually become, I think, our higher self. Is that where you were going with that? With the talking about the shadow traits?
I can go so many directions.
Let's share one of them.
I have a pet peeve, and you hit it. This might be like a reoccurring thing that I sneak into the episodes, my pet peeves. So I have to say that first and foremost, I think of light and darkness a little bit more like a pendulum swing compared to your dimmer switch.
Yeah.
And people that inherently are like, I'm a good person, or, XYZ, I'm always like, you can only be as light as you are dark. So the thing about going through a spiritual awakening is the fact that you get to meet your darkness. And if you fully encompass it and listen to it, that shadow self, or those, if you don't know what shadow self is, those negative, quote unquote, emotions that you don't necessarily like about yourself, or the insecurities, the shame, the guilt, um, the absence of freedom, isolation, things of that nature. But that darkness is required to actually achieve the full fulfillment. So have you ever played with what is it? Newton's
Yeah.
so have you ever played with Newton's, was it toy? It's escaping me.
I don't remember what it's called. I keep wanting to call it an octavarium because it's on the front of a Dream Theater album that says octavarium, but I don't think that's what it's called. I don't remember.
I'm going to give the opportunity for the audience to help me out here and put it in the comments. But it's that toy that basically has the metal balls that as you swing, you see that as the opposite direction goes, the energy must be returned to the opposite side to have the full pendulum swing. You're actually Googling it. I see it right now.
It's Newton's cradle.
Cradle.
Yeah.
Like starting to mouth it. Yes, Newton's cradle. And so that is how I see light and darkness. If you truly want to know who you are, you do have to go into that self-exploration and see the full pendulum swing. I only know what I'm capable of because of how dark I've been. That's how much good or light I can bring into the world on the opposite side. But my pet peeve was that absolutely no one can cross your boundaries, Seth. The only person that can cross your boundaries is you. So,
Well, yeah, that's a different perspective, but you can allow people to do it, and that's what you mean when you say you're crossing your boundaries.
it's like you cannot cross your, if you don't like how someone's treating you, or if you don't like something, like that's a self-reflection. I believe people are mirrors, which is what came out of my spiritual awakening. To make it a little bit more full circle, is I learned all about how just when you take the step back from the 3D worlds, you can really start to see how everything's starting to work for you and not against you. And that every interaction that you have with any person that you meet, even nature or even dogs, you know me, I love my dog. Any like animals, they're reflections of your energy. And that gets into a little bit more of like what you can do once you understand your spiritual awakening. But nonetheless, I feel that no one can cross your boundaries except for that one violation we won't get into. But more importantly, mirrors. You get to see how you can show up and expand your reality through spiritual awakening. So I'm going to kind of switch gears a little bit if you're okay with it.
Yeah, I love those two analogies. They got me thinking of some other stuff, but we can maybe come back to that.
Just spiritual awakenings in general. We could probably have a whole like 5 episodes on just what spiritual awakenings are like. But what do you think is the biggest benefits or like reasons why somebody would want to go through a spiritual awakening?
I don't know. Sometimes when you're going through it, it's like you wouldn't wish it on anybody, but I think it's one of those things where you don't realize how awake you can be until you are awake. I have a quote that people don't realize that they've been asleep until they start to wake up. It's like a dream. You think for sure that the dream is real. It seems real. And then it's not until you're awake again that you realize how unreal it really was. Or it's like when you go for 3 or 4 years without eating fast food and then you all of a sudden eat it and you realize, God, that's how much better I actually feel. And when I eat that stuff every day, I feel terrible, but I'm so used to feeling terrible that it doesn't feel like there's a difference. So it's almost like one of those things you have to go through it and be on the other side of it to understand what the benefit is, because the benefit is that it's like being on the top of the mountain and being able to see miles out into the distance, as opposed to being on the ground where just the trees and the underbrush in front of you and even the mountain itself seem like insurmountable obstacles. And I think the things that I worry about now I don't worry nearly as much about things in the material world, like about where money's going to come from or any of that stuff. And I know what it's like to not have it and to sleep on a park bench with a newspaper as a blanket. And it's not pleasant to do that. But it's like those things that used to seem like these big insurmountable obstacles that would cause this huge spike of adrenaline in my chest the second I experienced them. It's like they're like little flea bites now. And that's really nice. But I mean, you still experience anxiety, but you have to really go through something that really just shatters your heart to experience it. So I think that's one of the benefits is that you don't, the things that typically cause you a lot of anxiety and insecurity and doubt, it's just like the volume is turned down on them. How about you?
Hmm. I want to touch a little bit on what you just said, and then I'll answer the question. You might have to remind me the question though.
Okay.
So it reminds me of when I was in Colombia and I was sitting with one of my gurus. This was when I was getting my yoga school, just for like reference. Everybody that had like showed up, they originally thought that their spiritual awakening was going to be like going to a yoga class or, journaling, words of affirmation every day, that soft love, which is part of it. But for all of us, when we were kind of sharing together, it was more like somebody took us on like a really, really dark roller coaster that like had all the haunted characters that like showed up out of nowhere at the same time and kept on getting scared in these different types of ways. But then when you're done with the roller coaster ride, you're like, oh, that was kind of fun. Like, that wasn't so bad, right?
Yeah.
But the yogi philosophy, or you want to go into like Krishna, because I see you're bringing up Toli, you're bringing up Young. You're going to bring up a little bit of the spirituality side. Krishna would say that the opposite of suffering is knowledge. And to really retrieve yourself from the human experience and be able to see that wide scape of the mountains and like just all the valleys and all the trees, is you do have to actually take the steps to learn what's out there, because ignorance is not bliss at the end of the day. If you're living in ignorance on a daily basis, you really don't understand the power that you can have in your reality. And that's where isolation and fear, and even the ultimate fear, the fear of death, comes into play. Versus if you really start to see the inner workings of not only, our planet and beautiful Mother Nature, but all of consciousness, how people work, how energy works, you can actually be a co-creator. And I feel like that's one of the biggest benefits. If you can get through this roller coaster and all these scary demons that are coming at you and be like, oh, that wasn't so bad, is you get to be in this partnership of
Yeah.
creativity. So,
No, that's good. There's a fellow who does some, I don't remember where he does his research, but he does research on something called mental bandwidth. And he studied that when people are living in poverty and they're worried about where their next meal is going to come from, that so much of their mental bandwidth is eaten up by those worries that they don't have the energy to think about higher level creative things again. And so you're right. When you get freed up from worrying about all those obstacles on the ground, it's like you have this surplus of conscious energy. You have it, and it also transmutes your other types of energy, you talk about the transmutation of a sexual energy and of the root chakra energy that elevates to those higher levels of consciousness because it's no longer obsessing over those things we typically do. And it does give you a lot of extra energy. I think the caution there is that you make sure you use it on something, because sometimes what people will do, and a lot of new Christians will do this, is they become really intoxicated by like the romantic era of becoming like born again. And some people who experience a more Eastern spiritual awakening are like this, where they want to keep going out and having those experiences, like the deep meditations and the plant medicine journeys and the stuff, and that are these euphoric experiences, which are fine, but there is a difference between enlightenment and escapism. The whole purpose of getting out into that realm, outside of the matrix and the whirlwind of chaos that is your everyday life, is to hopefully import something back into this world, the matrix, or Mara, as the Buddhists call it. And, it can be useful for manifesting things in the world that can make your life better, but also set an example for other people who hopefully will become inspired by it and want to seek their own spiritual awakening.
I feel like this is one of those vulnerable moments for me because of what you mentioned, as far as like you get so caught up in that mental space whenever things are just not as you see, like this 3D reality, what you want, right? Because you're like starting to understand that you went through this darkness, You know that there's more energies out there, like more co-creation ability. And when your physical body, whether it's your health or whether it's your finances or even just not having a home and being on a park bench with a newspaper, like when that's not matching, I feel like it's very important to say that you could have gone through the spiritual awakening. You could have had three and still find yourself going down those staircases again momentarily,
Yeah.
spiraling and being like, how am I going to make rent this month? Or how am I going to pull off getting that promotion? Or how am I going to lose that 20 pounds or that 50 pounds? Because the physical world isn't matching up with your desires. So I just kind of want to take a break on that part and say, like, you could be enlightened and you can know the knowledge and still go down that staircase again and figure out that maybe you thought you learned a lesson or you thought that you mastered that level, but there's more work to be done there, which I feel is where you get those mini awakenings or those mini expansions.
I want to ask you about that. I just want to say, like, I'm glad you sent this in this direction because I was thinking about that Buddhist saying the other day, how before enlightenment, you carry water and you chop wood, and after enlightenment, you carry water and you chop wood. And there is this desire sometimes when a person becomes spiritually awake to like exit the matrix completely and not go back to learn those lessons. It's like at the end of the Gunslinger series that Stephen King wrote. He gets all the way to this end of this enormous spiritual pilgrimage. And at the end, he has to go back and learn this very practical lesson. I'm not going to say what it is because I don't want to ruin it for everybody who hasn't read it. But it's like you get to the end of the book. It's like that's the one lesson that he had to go back for. But there are important lessons we can learn in our everyday life, like the way that we handle a dispute with somebody, or when we can't pay our rent, or when our bank account craters. And sometimes it is necessary to go back to those experiences. So I want to ask you, like, what's the difference when after you're spiritually awakened, something like that happens and you're forced to confront it? What is the different perspective that you bring after the spiritual awakening? And how can a person make sure that they actually stay in that perspective instead of falling back into the one that they typically use to try to solve that problem?
Mm-hmm. So this reminds me of Yolong with the existential theory type of work he does of like, who am I? And like, my death is coming closer type of ideology. So I would say that before your spiritual awakening, it's like you have none of the tools. You're like that innocent child in a way versus, okay, if you don't have any of the tools, you don't know anything. Like it's that ignorance again. How can you get out of the situation unless you have somebody that comes alongside you? And this is where I love to work with survivors of abuse and like that whole feedback loop of like, if you've never been able to overcome this, you kind of need the guide, you kind of need the mentor, you kind of need somebody to give you the knowledge. And that's what makes spirituality so beautiful is the people that have obtained the knowledge, they tend to be very giving when it comes to sharing these experiences or sharing quote unquote tools. Versus, as you know, on a personal level, I've had a really rough summer. Probably one of the roughest summers
Yeah.
I've had in a decade where I had that kind of crumbling down type of thing when it came to my physical realm. And I've been in a place approximately 10 years ago where I had nothing. I was coming out of slavery. I literally had no identity. I had no money. I was a knucklehead kid still at the moment, and I didn't have any of those tools. Versus fast forward 10 years, I've been collecting gifts and tools and knowledge from both the Western side and the psychotherapy side and the spiritual side by going and exploring more of the yoga and the tantra and just holistic practicalities. So nowadays, it's almost like you get to recalibrate yourself. And no one's going to say that you're perfect at it. I was not perfect at it. In fact, I had to really lean into a lot of other people that I knew had the right mindset and had also gone through their spiritual awakenings to helped me, which is why we want a superior. I kind of actually like how I was about to say that, a superior spiritual community. Try to say that 3 times fast.
Superior. No, I can't do it. Can't get to one.
But that's why the spiritual community becomes so important. And having mentors is, we're still humans, right? At the end of the day, having this lovely experience, or if you want to be extremely spiritual, quote unquote, we are spiritual beings having a human experience. But after you go through 1, 2, 3, these awakenings, maybe you're on your 10th or 20th, you have more tools to be able to recalibrate yourself, and you won't find yourself falling for the same things over and over. So this latest one, I would say, was way more masculine, as far as it had to do with my security, my foundation, finances, versus what I would actually call my truest, hardest spiritual awakenings, was everything to do about my feminine energy, because it took away the beauty of everything. It took away the luminescence, as you love to like point out that word to me. And I love that I learned that word from you. And it took away all of the mirror type of illusion that this world can offer you. So I don't ever look in the mirror anymore and feel the shame that I felt for the first 20 years of me living, or the body dysphoria that came with that spiritual awakening, or the not feeling good enough as far as like, I'm not enough. Like all of that overcame in that, to where I have those tools to, whenever I work with somebody and they don't necessarily like how they look, or they feel like they have to have a lot of the external validation, whether it's from a parent or from a boyfriend, a girlfriend, a husband, a wife, and to be able to kind of turn that mirror and be like, no, this validation needs to come from you. So that's a tool I got to have out of that. Doesn't mean that there's not occasionally a day where I'm like, I don't like that pimple on my cheek, but I don't let it be into the turmoil anymore. I see the world more expansively as what beauty is. So every kind of spiritual awakening, or even expansion of thought, I think allows that. And whenever you are going through it, I can lean into someone like you. You conquered the masculine, seeing yourself go 5 times or 5x on an income from nowhere, from homelessness to, 300,000, right? I may not have that tool. So if I can lean into you for that one, we're doing good, right? Like that's why you want to grow the community. That's kind of, I think, the benefit of collecting those, but also the human experience of, you might be pushed back a little bit and told restart, or you missed it, or you went too fast.
I think I love that, because it reminds me of what Paul says about the body of Christ, how there's different parts of the body that specialize in different things. And if something that's difficult that happens to you forces you to go out there and connect with other people, that's one of the most spiritual things that we do, is connect with other people who are an expression of the same universal, infinite, living mind that we are, that everything comes from. And sometimes the more spiritual we become, the less help we think we should need, because we think we should be able to fix all that stuff of ourselves. But you talked about holding on to your identity and not allowing your identity and who you understood that you are to fall apart because things in your life fall apart. But it's also understanding that we're part of a larger identity, a body of spiritual people that specialize in different things. And that's why I think the authentic connections that we're talking about building here with this podcast and with the events and with everything else is really important, especially because, that tends to be something that that's more of a feminine type of approach to it. Guys are about being autonomous and self-sufficient, but we need other men, other spiritual men in our life just as much as anybody else does.
That fits back into Yolam a little bit, and even Alder for the psychology aspect of it. In isolation, you discover who you are. In community, you discover what your purpose is. So whenever you go in, I guess the masculine tendencies is, I only really expect three things from my masculine people in my life, my men in my life, is protect, provide, provision, right? Very much, I've got this, I'm on my own, I can do it. And I have noticed that when men are starting their spiritual journey, they kind of fall into that, like, no, I'm not going to listen to you. I'm going to go read it for myself. Or, I'm going to go take a more directive approach to my spirituality versus I feel that most women, we're going to go attend a meditation circle, or we're going to go and build a beautiful mandala together and share experiences and that more soft approach to spirituality. But I would say that there's been times where I should have, looking back, went and read those texts. I should have challenged what I was hearing, what I was experiencing, versus just going along with the flow that happens with the women, or the feminine approach, I would say. And particularly one example I would say that a lot of people fall into is plant medicine. They immediately think that if you're starting your spiritual awakening, you need to go have an ayahuasca journey, or that you need to go into the deep jungle of Peru and, take ceremony with the toad, and just these leaps that are very aggressive leaps. But you don't have to go that approach to still have a beautiful spiritual awakening or an expansion of your consciousness. So balance, right? It's all about balance.
Yeah, that reminds me of what Sun Tzu talks about. Not Sun Tzu. It's I can't remember. It'll come to me in just a second. But he was the ancient Chinese mystic who they think wrote the Tao Te Ching, Lao Tzu. And he tells this story about this guy who's learning from these two spiritual teachers, and the spiritual teachers are kind of competing over who, he's my student, and they have different ways of approaching things. And the guy becomes so disoriented by these teachers who he thought were these spiritually elevated people fighting over like who is his real teacher, that he's like, screw it, I'm just going to go home and I'm just going to tend to my farm, and I'm going to help my wife wash the dishes and clean the clothes, and I'm just going to tend to things within my house. And he didn't leave his house for 2 years. And the story goes that when he did finally come out of that period of his life, that he was the most centered and focused and spiritually grounded person in the village. People were astonished, and they're like, what did you do? And he didn't do anything different. It was just the way in which he did it. It was everyday household things that he was doing, and he realized that he could find the enlightenment that he was looking for out there. It's like you say, you can go out to the jungles of Peru and go on this crazy plant, and by the way, we're not against using those types of things to elevate your spiritual growth, but it's like, are you using those for the sake of escapism or for the sake of enlightenment? Because there's opportunities right here in the practical world, just in the way that you sweep your floor, or the way that you say hello to somebody, or the way that you treat somebody when you order a coffee or you go through the checkout line. There's opportunities for expansion of your consciousness and spiritual growth everywhere, which sounds like what you're saying.
I would go as far to say that maybe it's not escapism. Maybe it's for the person that's just very ambitious. When you start really starting to see what all is out there, or to not see, if you want to go with Anja or the third eye, you kind of want to jump ahead, go to 1 dimension, 2 dimension, 3 dimension, so forth. And my advice, looking back not only on my journey, but on my friends, my clients, just even family, I would say just keep it simple. Like, the plant medicine will be there for you. It's not going anywhere, right? Like, in yoga, the most honest pose is the pose that you have today, not tomorrow, not, yesterday. If I can do a handstand today, but not tomorrow, that doesn't mean that it won't be available for me the next day. But that's probably, not that you asked, not that anybody asked, my biggest advice when it comes to exploring the spiritual awakening of just keep it simple. You do not have to master every single avenue. There are so many different ways, and there's no correct way to approach it. So if you meet somebody that says that they are a spiritual guru or a healer, I don't like it when people say healer, because I
know that.
I don't like it. There is no master in this. If there was, they want to be here. And that's kind of my heart to heart with people, or my tough love of, if somebody had truly mastered all of spirituality and are at the ability to say that they are, the absolute top peach of the crop, then they want to be here. And just if they did elevate or ascend and have collected a lot of these lessons, they haven't collected every lesson. And they haven't collected it in the way that you're going to collect it. Like, my life experience and your life experience between, Seth and me has been vastly different, right? But we've collected similar experiences, similar lessons. But I would never go to somebody and be like, you have to learn it this way, or this is the answer, or this is the way that it must be. Like, just like in yoga or tantra, like, you will find that your masterpiece, the painting of your spiritual awakening, is yours. And that's what makes it so beautiful. So no one can heal you. No one can awaken you. Like, these are things that you get to create. So there's my second pet peeve of the podcast. So.
Well, the more colors and details that you have to paint with, the more of a unique expression you're going to have. I mean, to follow your original metaphor about the spiritual awakening, maybe this is a good way to start wrapping things up. And I want to ask you about like what you would do with someone as a client, depending on where they are in their spiritual journey, and also talk about some of the things that we're planning in terms of the events and the meditation retreats. But let's say that somebody's listening to this, because there's probably some people who are going through a spiritual awakening right now, but maybe some people feel like they're overdue for one, or they're frustrated because they had one a while back and feel stagnant, or maybe they feel like they've been kind of sucked back into the first floor type of thinking. And they really just need some simple, not complicated way to get unstuck and to start moving in the right direction again. If somebody came to you in that state right now, what would be the first couple of things you would guide them through?
So I think of it like playing the game of love. Do you remember that board game?
I do.
Like, am I showing my age? So
I remember the ones before that too.
with that, my personal approach is choose what path you feel most natural, what's going to lead to the most self-acceptance. I'm someone that loves to marry the Western philosophies with the Eastern philosophies. Somebody may not even be comfortable with the word spiritual awakening. They may be just looking to expand their consciousness or change their mindset. That's another way that spiritual awakening can have a synonym. So to keep it very simple is like, okay, what's more natural? Let's elevate your mindset, or let's expand your consciousness. As somebody that's leading and helping guide that journey, I feel like that's our responsibility. Seth, I think you would agree with me on that one. From there, it's, okay, here's all these beautiful tools or avenues, almost like going down that theme of life, that board game, where maybe for you, like, yoga is the best way to like be able to approach it and be able to navigate it. Maybe it's tantra. Maybe it's reading books. Maybe it's listening to podcasts. Maybe it's, joining a friend at, some type of event that has a different way of thinking, just exploration. There's so many different ways to go about it, but I would say, okay, what is most natural for you to be able to be in a good, positive learning state and environment? Because if you don't feel safe and you don't feel seen whenever you're sitting down with somebody, then you're never going to be able to kind of relax enough to absorb a different type of way of thinking, or even open enough, because you're going to be too busy trying to make sure that you feel safe. So choosing an avenue together and having these different types of ways to approach a spiritual awakening, I feel like is the safest overall for your mental health and emotional health. It's easier for some people to be like, okay, I'm going to sit in this calm environment. Here's a cup of tea. You tell me what you've been experiencing, quote unquote, the more talk therapy type of approach.
Yeah.
Some people, especially my male clients, don't like to talk. They don't want to tell you how they feel, right? And they're like, no one's ever even asked them really how they feel. But if you put them in a room where they can have some type of physical activity or, it's some type of learner based expansion, then suddenly they're starting to click with things within their own consciousness and their own way of being. So that kind of goes back to you get to paint your own canvas, just hand somebody the tools. And if they get stuck, just kind of be like that painter's assistant and hand them another tool. Here's another cup of tea.
That is fun.
So how do you approach it?
Well, I want to say something first for the guys listening who may not have understood what Eric just said about not wanting to talk about something, going out and doing activities. Men are problem solvers. When we run into the rock in the road, we're going to figure out how to move it. But as we're sitting there at home, we don't probably think about a rock in the road and how we would move it. We have to be confronted with the thing in reality. And what that does is it lights up a part of our imagination. It gets us thinking in ways that we normally wouldn't, because I think because we try to conserve our energy, so if talk therapy isn't, I think what she's saying is talk therapy doesn't work for a guy because he can't think of how to articulate his feelings. The second you get him out there and you start getting him trying to solve a problem, and he runs into a problem that he can't solve, and it forces his mind to think out of the box and think of a more creative way, he's going to confront all kinds of things. Number one, he might realize he's not as patient as he thought he was. He might realize that he is maybe he's not as autonomous as he thought he was, because the first thing he starts doing is blaming people around him instead of looking for a way to solve the problem. And the self-awareness comes out of this active desire to solve a problem. And it's the same thing, self-awareness to just sitting down and talking about it versus being confronted with a problem that forces you to confront a part of yourself, like that tells you, I'm not as confident as I thought I was. I'm not as patient as I thought I was. I'm not as much of a nice person as I thought I was. I think that's what, to give a male perspective on that in case some guys were confused. But how I approach it is I tell people to focus on the things they can control, because, and surrender is a huge part of becoming spiritually free. But if you feel like you're stuck, usually a lot of the time it's because, like you said, there's so many things in your environment that are out of alignment with who you are and what your skill set is. And you feel like you need to change those things or do something about them or change yourself drastically in a way where you can cope with them better. And sometimes what you got to do is let go of the need to control those things, to worry about them, and just to say, okay, what are the things that I can control? And sometimes the only thing you can control is getting up in the morning and taking 21 deep, very focused breaths, but that gets you thinking in your body again. And maybe the next thing you do is you decide you're going to fast from electronics and not look at an electronic screen from 5 to 9. And that's a very small step that you can take, but that's the thing you can control. You can't control how somebody else, well, you can sort of control how people treat you, but there's a lot of things that we worry so much about and we expend so much of our energy on that we can't control. And I think if you keep trying to do that, you stay stuck. So I tell people, like one of my clients a couple of months ago, she said, I need more direction in my life. I need more direction in my business. And I knew she had the answers to all her problems. I didn't need to tell her what to do. I said, you don't need direction. You need space. You need to carve out 3 or 4 hours out of the week when no one messes with you, no one talks to you, no one interrupts you, no one comes knocking on the door, and just allow your mind to start working on these problems. And it worked. She started coming up with her own solutions, but she had to get herself out of that whirlwind of chaos and create space for herself.
Keep it simple.
Yeah, complexity is good if you know what you're doing, like if you're building a space shuttle or something like that. But if you're surrounded by a lot of stuff you can't control, complexity is like the dragon of chaos. It's going to take you down eventually.
Well, that's the whole point of the spiritual awakening, right? Is you're keep it simple while you're going through it. Gain all your lovely tools, all of the experiences, all your lessons, and then you'll be able to paint whatever canvas you want to paint on the other side. But one step at a time, one day at a time, maybe even one day or
one moment, one action at a time, one breath at a time.
So how about you share a little bit about those events and other things that we have coming up?
Yeah, so there's there's two things we want to do. We want to start doing some local events, which are just like some group meditation and sessions where we help people to make authentic connections. And what I found is that a lot of networking events, whether it's a business event or a speed dating event or whatever it is, it's kind of like you're just tossed into the room together, and maybe you have stations where you each talk to one another, but there's not really the most effective networking meetings that I've been to are where a person facilitates some sort of discussion, like they have icebreakers or exercises that you do that get you talking to people you wouldn't normally talk to in ways that you wouldn't normally talk to them. So we'll talk about doing some business and some dating events like that where people get the opportunity to interact, but that's only half the equation, right? That's just making the connections with people you wouldn't normally meet. The other thing is group, full immersive group meditation and sound healing, breath work sessions, whatever it is. And the reason why we'll talk about doing this in person is because a lot of people are doing these meditation sessions on Zoom now, which is efficient, but it's not nearly as effective as full immersion, where all of your senses, like, I think about the difference when you're meditating on a Zoom call and you still got all the distractions of your life going on around you, like your dog trying to get attention and like the person working outside on the lawn and then someone coming knock on the door, the phone ringing, your text chiming, as opposed to being in a place where the mood is set in terms of incense burning or the surround sound, the lighting being set right, the temperature in the room, your your interaction with the people as you go in, where every single one of your senses is immersed in the experience, has a much more transformative effect and a lasting effect if you're trying to get rid of stress or just get more clarity. And I think going to a session like that, that's 2 or 3 hours once a month, is more effective than doing it every day if you're doing it with a lot of other distractions. So that's what we want to do in terms of the local events. The events that actually are going to take places in like Tulum or Costa Rica or places like that, that's a complete unplug. That's the journey out into the jungle that we were talking about earlier, where you completely unplug from the whirlwind of chaos that is your everyday life. You turn the volume down on all those worries and fears and insecurities and other noise that's surrounding you. And you actually take an introspective look inside of your own mind and figure out I think there's two things that you figure out. Number one, what story are you telling yourself? Because it's our internal narrative about what we believe that we deserve, how valuable we are, what our purpose is in life, how we interpret the things that have happened to us in our past, how we interpret, what we hope to happen in our future. Those stories really run our identity in our life. And you can try to make all the to-do lists and download all the meditation apps and the calendars or whatever it is and try to make changes that way. But if you don't change your internal story, drastically change your internal story, you're always going to be struggling. And so one of the things I'm hoping we can do with some of these events where we get them out of their environment is help them to really discover what their story is and write a new and empowering story that can help them to show up in their life as their full and authentic self. Your turn.
My turn. So I would definitely agree. If you are wanting kind of more accelerated change, then the retreats or the weekends would be a really good approach. We won't necessarily drag you down to Peru in the jungle unless you're ready for that. But I would say even before that, like, to be able to establish the spiritual community and really bring more of Miami together is the focus. That's why we're hosting the podcast. That's why we're sharing our knowledge. We're not holding back. We're giving real testimonies. I'm being vulnerable here. That was my first promise. I'm going to keep it throughout the entire thing. Seth is going to continue to research, because if I know anything about you, you're going to always be fact-checking and bringing more to the table. So I just feel like there's so much more value no matter where you're at. If you've never heard of spiritual awakening or if you're on your third, here is a good space where you can be heard. You can share your experiences. You can put Newton's Cradle in the comments if you stay the entire time. I would appreciate that. Shout out to Newton. And just really along for the journey, because every single time that we get to share and we get to have that feedback, I feel like everyone elevates.
Yeah, absolutely. And the connections are going to be really important. So why don't we finish up by telling people how they can connect? And also, we're looking for people who have interesting stories to tell to interview on this podcast, whether you're an expert and just want to share some of the stories about the people who you're guiding through their spiritual journey, or if you have a story that you believe can give hope to other people and clarity to other people, and or if nothing else, just remind them that they're not alone, right? That you've been through something very much like what they've been through. It helps to hear those types of stories. So anyone who knows of a good guest for this podcast or themselves, just get in contact with us. Um, You'll see my name here on the video screen for the podcast, and I'll put my social media links below here. I'm not going to try to spell my name. I think both of our names are hard to spell, but we'll make sure we put that information so you can connect with us on social media to get updates about these podcasts and future things that we're doing. And then I'll let Air finish up by telling you where to get in touch with her.
Mm. So we'll definitely put everything in the show notes. And from social media, my name's not that hard. I cut in half. Aaron.
Mine is harder. I'm talking about the last names.
I don't have a last name. It's just there. So nonetheless, we're going to put everything in the show notes for you to be able to connect with us on Instagram, on the website. But I feel like something we should highlight is our meetup group, which is spiritual focused. It is a spiritual community where you can find the events, or if you have a venue, definitely a place where we can host an event.
Yep.
So I want to kind of throw out our meetup group. I'm going to put that in the show notes as well for us. And the one thing I'm not sure that we were able to discuss before our podcast, we were so excited to get on, is how do we want to sign off, Seth?
I haven't really thought about that, but I didn't write a script for it. So we will just say that, again, the purpose of this whole thing is to guide people through their spiritual awakening. So no matter what phase you are at, if you're going through a spiritual awakening, if you're going through the dark night of the soul, as Evelyn Underhill calls it, or just dedicated to getting to the next level in your spiritual awakening, this is the place for you to be, to connect with other people and to hear some other perspectives. But also, more importantly, we want to join people together here in the city of Miami. And so if, again, if you know somebody who has a good story or has a good connection in the community or can help us to achieve our goal, we would certainly appreciate if you would send those people our way.
I came up with one.
Cool. I've watched your time.
I'm so corny. I love it. Stay conscious, Miami.
Stay conscious, Miami. Bye, everybody.